We should be recording now. Okay. Well, because this is a lunch and learn, and in the interest of leaving plenty of time for questions, if anybody has any at the end, let's just go ahead and launch into it, I think. So I want to say hi to everybody. And as people are filing in, absolutely, welcome and thank you for joining. Just a very brief introduction from me. I'm Angela Cummings. I am the Executive Director of our Illinois chapter of American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. We love the Research Connection. Meg's going to talk a little bit more about why we love Research Connection so much. But we're just very happy to have you here today. We do 2 Research Connections a year. One of them we try to do in person, and the other we try to do virtually, just to really give everybody a chance to connect to this in whatever way they can. And a lunch and learn is certainly a very well-worn format at this point since we've been through Zoom. So we thank you for joining us on what is probably your lunch hour. This is a webinar, so your microphone and your camera are both muted. You do have the opportunity, though, to ask questions in the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your screen, or the chat, which is at the bottom of your screen. And Meg and I will both be monitoring that. So having said that, I'm just going to go ahead and pass it right over to Meg and let you introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Meg, and I have been AFSP Illinois Research Connection, coordinator for over 10 years. These events are special to me for 2 reasons. One, there's always hope to be found in better understanding of how the mind works. And 2, I love that I have the opportunity to tangibly show you where your fundraising dollars go. Speaking of which, please go to walkinillinois.org to find your nearest AFSP Illinois fundraiser to support suicide prevention, research like this, and this provides funds for AFSP Illinois to provide all programming, including this, for free. Leslie, thank you for taking time out of your day to share your important work with us. We are grateful for your time and research and look forward to learning more about it. And as Angela said, we'll be doing questions at the end, but feel free to pop them in the chat or the Q&A at any time. If it's AFSP Illinois related, Angela and I will answer in the chat. If it's a question for Leslie, we'll circle back at the end. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Meg. And in the interest of time, we're just going to pass it right along to Dr. Adams. You may have seen in some of the stuff that I had sent out earlier in the email. Dr. Adams was one of our AFSP Young Investigator Grant recipients, and I'm just going to pass it straight over to her, let her take it away and talk about her background, her research, and all these great findings. So thank you so much, Dr. Adams.
Great, thank you so much. You guys can hear me okay, hopefully, Angela and Meg. Okay, thank you guys so much, and I'm so appreciative again to both Angela and Meg for bringing me on today. It's been such a pleasure to work with AFSP and learn so much about how the money is coming straight from individuals that have interest in advocacy and suicide prevention and research. And I am one of those direct recipients, as Angela said. So I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Mental Health at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. So I'm currently in Baltimore, East Coast time. But I'm so thankful for you guys for, devoting your lunch hour or lunch moments to hearing me talk about the current research that was funded by my AFSP Young Investigators Award right during the pandemic. So from 2020 to it recently ended this year in 2023. And the title of my talk is Addressing the Crisis of Suicide Among Black Men. I talk about the real-time strategies that I've been employing with the funding from AFSP and future directions of the work because the urgency is just so needed. So this is a brief outline to get you guys oriented of what I'll talk about today. I always like to give motivations for my research because it's so very specific, but so very critical and important. I talk about the state of the literature, what we know and what we don't know about suicide with Black boys and men, and the crisis that we are currently managing in public health to address this. And then I'll launch into the research that was funded by AFSP from my research team, which is called GRACE. So without further ado, I'll just get started with the motivations of my research. And I always center this because my work is focused on African Americans, Black Americans, and implicitly the African diaspora. I always like to show people, just the visual of the transatlantic slave trade, which was from the 1500s to the late 1800s, where some over 12 million men, women, and children were brought to North and South America, as well as some places in Europe. And we hear a lot about this, we know a lot about this, but I use it to center my work in this visual in particular. One, that the African diaspora and the experience of being Black is incredibly broad and varied. So there is no one size fit all. And the other reason I show this visual is just to remind people that not only were things lost, but also things will need to be regained through research. During this period, Africans were not only removed from their physical environment, but they were also stripped of their psychological environment and safety. That means their languages and way of communication were removed, their traditional religious beliefs, values, and customs were removed. And so all of this has an impact on what we're seeing today in terms of the mental health of our communities. There's intergenerational and cultural transmission of these experiences, these traumas, and the changes of these psychological environments. I always like to position that. I also get a lot of feedback about, the crisis of Black suicide and how this isn't necessarily positioned in the same way as suicide in other racial and ethnic groups. But I always mention to folks that there are very, very early mentions of suicide along with the transatlantic slave trade. Its earliest manifestations, did come to be during that time. And this is just a picture of the Igbo landing and other, mass suicide events that did occur during that transatlantic slave trade that were a result of the enslaved men and women refusing to be part of the system and the different oppression that they knew they would be marching into. And so this is a poem I also have lifted here from George Wharton, which was a free man that lived in the United States in the 1800s. And so there have been mentions of suicide in the Black community and the African diaspora, and particularly among African Americans for quite some time. And so I always bring up that historical context so that people know this is not a recently emerging issue, but one that we're just now starting to pay attention to with research evidence and practice policies. So my program of research is threefold, a focus on the African diaspora, which I have again shown here. I look at a variation of things, not only just suicide, but also cross-cultural measurement of depression, understanding mental health care disparities. And what I'll talk about today and center in this AFSP talk is the early detection of suicide risk factors using real-time strategies. So all of that comes together is who I am as a researcher and what centers my work. Societally, what we understand about research in this area, also, because we're talking about Black men and Black boys, we need to think about what the structural realities are. What does the current environment look like for Black boys and men? For Black boys and men that influence their mental health outcomes. And so this visual, which I'll just play, and hopefully it's kind of moving along, comes in from the New York Times. It was a beautiful discussion and an article on race and economic opportunity in the United States. And the origins of racism cannot be separated from the origins of capitalism. They're very much intertwined. And so the structural realities that frame mental health care for Black boys and men must also consider these structural pieces. So essentially what this shows is that they followed close to 4,000 boys who grew up in upper socioeconomic rich families, wealthy families, and they kind of tracked them over time. And they showed that most white boys who are raised in these environments stay rich or upper middle class. But for Black boys, you can see the decline in their socioeconomic status. And a lot of the takeaway from this race and economic opportunity discussion was the influence of structural racism that changes the landscape of how boys transition into men and what their financial and economic opportunities are. All of those have an influence on men. And so that is a big piece of what I focus on and what I look at. I'm going to pivot now just to the state of the literature. I think, of course, since everyone has decided to take their lunch hour to be here, you have a vested understanding and knowledge of it. But I kind of want to dig into the details of what we understand for Black Americans specifically, just to center the work. So we have been seeing in the last 20 years, so in recent decades, a sharp increase in the suicide incidence of Black children. So this is epidemiology data that came from JAMA in 2015, and since we've kind of been adding on to that with the literature. But essentially in the last 20 years, 657 Black children have died by suicide in the United States. And this is not a small number. And you think about the loss of life, but also the reverberating loss for families, for communities, you know, for the potential of those young lives. And the disproportionate gender breakdown is also one of the reasons why I focus on boys and men specifically. Close to 84% of these individuals identified as male. And you're seeing over time how this is now starting to surpass other racial and ethnic groups. So this is from the same study, and they were tracking incidence and suicide rates of white and Black boys age 5, as young as 5, which is a really disheartening trend. But you can see how it was definitely more suicide rate, death, and incidents for white boys. But as we had transitioned into the early 2000s and the 2010s, Black boys were starting to surpass greatly the rates of those of white boys. And we don't have a lot of information as to why that is. Bringing this into some other information that was recently published by Ariel Sheftaw, who is also an AFSP awardee, a Young Investigator awardee, but she did some work using CDC data looking at suicide trends for Black youth from 2003 to 2017. So same, you know, span of decades over time, and saw a general increase from 5 to 11, from 12 to 14, but of really stark increases between 5 to 17, and, you know, when you look at the full picture from 5 to 17, really stark increases for Black boys who are at that blue line versus girls who are that gray line. I would say the crisis of suicide in the Black community has affected both Black boys and girls. And so you can kind of see the sharp increases from the 2016 and 2017 years on that right-hand side, really moving up in a direction that is really concerning. Whereas the rates for white Americans and white youth in particular have been declining over time. So while we're seeing an increase in Black young boys and girls, we're seeing a decrease or a leveling off from other racial and ethnic groups. Some more research that looks at the increases with Black adolescents. Again, all racial and ethnic groups experience an overall decline in thinking about suicide or planning suicide in this time frame in the past few decades. Whereas for Black adolescents, they experienced an increase. And so that was what I was referring to in the previous slide, that, you know, while we're seeing this sharp decrease and leveling off, we're seeing a big rise in this population. And those are continuing by linear trends and are very different. For Black girls, there are more attempts, and for Black boys, there's more injury by attempt. And so now we're starting to get in the weeds. Like this paper was published in 2019. So not that long ago, we're just now starting to get into the details of understanding the differences between boys and girls, the differences in suicide trends with Black Americans as they transition to adulthood. And so this is just kind of the lay of the land in the context, but there's a lot of unexplored factors that we don't know that are specific to Black males. And when we think about suicide research, and I'm going to highlight 3 in this talk today: Black ethnic identity, masculinity, and restrictive emotionality, which is a very jargony way of saying, you know, masculine gender roles and the importance of being a man. You know, think, you know, don't, you know, boys don't cry, you know, take it like a man. Some of those scripts that men and young boys learn as a young kid transitions into adulthood, and that has an impact on the emotional disclosure and what they are able to feel vulnerable and reveal in terms of their mental well-being. And of course, everyday racism, which has, you know, skyrocketed in the news and in media and personal, you know, attention, but has been a well-studied, you know, phenomenon over the years among Black scholars. So a lot of these have not really been folded into the work of suicide prevention research. And so that is what the funding from AFSP has allowed me to do. I'll just quickly talk about some first, thinking about Black ethnic identity. And so a lot of people are like, what is that? So it's a very multifaceted sense of belonging that is based on someone's shared cultural heritage. So what does that mean? That's very jargony. What does that mean? Essentially thinking of it into like 3 domains. So in terms of the extent to which someone being Black is important to their identity, so the centrality of being Black, I have a strong sense of belonging to Black people. how one person thinks of themselves, their own personal judgment of Black ethnicity, private regard, I am happy I am Black, and then public regard, how you think other groups view you as a Black person in the Black community. In that example, it's in general, other communities respect Black people. All of these things kind of move and grow together to form what is called Black ethnic identity. And this has not been fully explored with understanding suicide prevention. But my colleagues and I have been working on this extensively and have a new paper out that looks at ethnic identity and shaping the role of Black youth. And basically, again, like I showed you in that transatlantic slave trade picture, there's no one size fits all experience for Black adolescents. We found that they generally clustered into these three groups: the alienated group, where they really had low levels of attachment to their Black ethnic identity, that low ethnic identity, which is kind of their middle ground, and then undifferentiated. And so moving all of that together was pretty much how we had decided and found how ethnic identity was developed with Black youth. But we know that that changes over time as kids grow into adults. But different groups had different outcomes related to suicide. And so Caribbean Black adolescents were more likely to be in that low ethnic identification profile, and the undifferentiated group, which was this last really large group of close to 1,000 people in our sample, had higher proportions of suicidal thoughts and behaviors compared to those other groups. So I'm just using this to set the foundation of, not one size is going to fit all in terms of a solution for the work that we're planning using real-time strategies. Also, the emergence of everyday racism. There's been a lot of studies on racism and racial inequality, but there's been really little work done on the experience of everyday racism as it relates to suicide, and particularly for Black men. And so what is everyday racism? It's a daily, almost momentary, time to time instances of unfair experiences that are due to race. And this is quite a common experience. I would say not only Black Americans experience this. And so this is research from the Pew Center, which does all kinds of different types of surveillance and other large scale population surveys. But essentially they found that Black Americans who are in the yellow here are more likely to say that, yes, there are different instances of unfair experiences happening to them due to their race, such as people acting suspicious of them, people acting as though they thought they weren't smart, or being unfairly stopped by police. But we can kind of see in people being subject to slurs or jokes, for instance, there's definitely more Asian individuals that say that, yes, this has happened to them. And this was done in 2019. It's part of a really huge study called Race in America, which I really encourage you guys to look into, because it kind of breaks it down by race and ethnicity. So I say this to say, and I show this visual to say that the experience of discrimination is quite common. Almost every group, including white Americans, say that they've been unfairly targeted due to their race. What I want to illustrate here is that Black Americans perceive this at a higher rate. That has an influence on their mental well-being, their anxiety, their hypervigilance as they navigate the world, and it happens on an everyday or chronic basis. And what I want to mention here is that a lot of these external experiences of discrimination are disproportionately experienced by Black men. We know the media attention and the national attention focused on unfair stops of Black men, the unfair killings of young Black men who are at their full potential or not yet at their full potential of life. And so it was really important to me, again, to fold that into suicide research to really answer some unexplained questions that we have about the rise of suicide in this population. So these are the emerging questions that I'm going to talk to you about today. What can we do to enhance crisis interventions for Black men, particularly those that are moving from that adolescence to young adulthood stage? And how does everyday and the structural realities that these men face interplay with these factors to really heighten mental well-being or diminish mental well-being and suicide outcomes? So what is it about their daily experiences, their negative daily experiences, that might influence suicide that we just don't know on a moment-to-moment and everyday basis? And how can we understand that better to better inform crisis intervention? So all that to say, now getting into the crux of the issue, is that I'm so thrilled to talk about the current investigations from my team, which is called GRACE. Our team is based within the Department of Mental Health at Johns Hopkins and stands for the Gender, Racism, and Afrocentric Early Intervention Group. And it has a focus on the nature of suicide and other mental health outcomes such as depression and anxiety among Black boys and men. So I have my website here. I'll put it up again at the end of the slide to just show all the different work that we're doing on this topic. But it's important to show the team because I am not the only person doing this work. I have a lot of people helping me, and I definitely want to lift those individuals up as great collaborators and junior colleagues for this work. So I'll move into it and excited to share my study here. It's funded by the American Foundation of Suicide Prevention, who has sponsored today's talk. Looking at the examination of suicide in real time among young adult Black males. And there's a picture of a man using a smartphone because that is the key mechanism of which we're in, understanding how suicide is working and heightening for these individuals by using their smartphone that a lot of people have. I'm going to do some quick academic jargon. I use a anchoring framework that a lot of researchers have used and studied to understand suicide, and it's called the interpersonal theory of suicide. It's well studied, and it's a guiding theory of the work I'm going to present today. Broadly, the theory suggests that suicidal desire emerges when individuals experience, different feelings of loss, alienation, or burdensomeness. So things are starting to pop up. And these are the different terminologies: thwarted belongingness, so feeling like you have a need to belong and that's being unmet, which can cause a range of negative health outcomes. So I'm alone, I don't belong. Hopelessness, I might as well give up because there's nothing I can do to make things better for me. It's a common thing that a lot of people who are dealing with mental health crisis experience. Capability of suicide, which means, that fear of death is slowly being eroded over time to the point that folks are not fearing death. Sorry, this was on a weird timer. And then burdensomeness, the facet of social disconnection or, individuals really incorrect mental calculation or, things that individuals make regarding their death being worth more than their life to others and people around them. So I'm a burden to others. All of these different variables combined have an influence on suicidal desire, and that's what we study in this project. There is a very clear kind of pathway about how this works, which I have highlighted here. We're feeling alienated through thwarted belongingness and feeling like a burden work synergistically to enhance feelings of hopelessness. Like I really, really don't feel hopeful about life because I don't belong and I'm a burden to others. And that starts a cascade of influencing suicidal desire and a lethal or near lethal suicide attempt. What's important about my study, and which I kind of alluded to, is that the research doesn't really influence or incorporate the aspect of race-related stress, of everyday racism and structural racism. And so that is the work that I have been kind of tinkering with this AFSP funded project to understand how do racialized experiences influence suicide and crisis intervention support for Black men. So I'll pivot to what we're doing and how we do it. So I wish this was a little bit more, usually I'm able to see folks, but usually I ask people like, what percentage of Americans do you guys think use smartphones? And then I get all sorts of different comments in the chat, but essentially I'll kind of cut to the chase here and show again from Pew Research Center that close to 96% of Americans, young Americans 18 to 29 own a smartphone. That is a huge, huge, huge population that holds, something that could be a key tool for crisis intervention. And then we are seeing similarly high numbers, a little bit lower, but similarly high. 83% of Black Americans use a smartphone. So if we're thinking of ways to meet people where they are in real time to think about crisis intervention, a smartphone is an amazing tool to develop and create apps and different tools to ask people how are they doing and check in with them. I am not the only person that has used this. There's been a long legacy of suicide prevention researchers that use smartphones. But this is one of the first to be applied for Black American men. And using the smartphone, we're really interested in how mood adjusts over time. So we use this tool and this method called ecological momentary assessment. And so this consists of asking people that are in our studies questions on a daily basis or a moment-to-moment basis with very little interruption to their day-to-day routine. They'll get a small little ping on their smartphone and say, hey, can you do a 30-second survey? And in that 30-second survey, it's how are you doing? How are you feeling? What's going on with your mental well-being right now? And is there anything we can do to support you? Just 30 seconds, a couple times a day. And that provides some real continuous assessment that reflects what is going on in people's daily lives, what's happening in their neighborhoods, what's happening in their context all around them. This is not new. Again, this is also known as experience sampling or daily diary research in other literature, but it's really useful in understanding short-term risk factors or crisis-related risk factors that we can detect in real time and provide real-time solutions. So in the long time ago, this used to be done with like pencil and paper and personal, like what do you call it? I can't even think, I was gonna say Bluetooth, but I can't even remember the word anymore. Palm Pilots, all kinds of different things. But now we can just ask participants that have an existing smartphone, hey, download this app so that we can check in on you and support you over the day. And so what you're seeing here from day 1 to 7, you can see with each beep, you're getting different aspects about their mental state, different aspects and understanding about their mental well-being, knowing what some of their triggers are in the day and based on location or based on stress, and get just a really clear snapshot about how this informs their mental well-being in their crisis situation. Again, like I said, I'm not the first one to use this method, but it has certainly skyrocketed in the past, I would say 5 years. And only 35 scientific articles have been published using ecological momentary assessment to assess suicidal thoughts and behavior. So it's an emerging, I hope there's some researchers or other clinicians in this group that can really think about leveraging mobile technology and smartphones to understand suicide in real time, because it's a really growing area and we need a lot more research on whether it works. So the study objectives are twofold. First, the study objective was to understand the role of everyday racial discrimination on suicidal thoughts and behaviors. Because I'm based at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, we made it a very small pilot using AFSP money to understand this with young adult men residing in Maryland. But we do hope to expand this possibly to Illinois in the near future. And then we wanted to understand if this approach was feasible. A lot of what I have to think about as a researcher and as a Black American myself is like, how do people feel about being tracked? How do people who are in crisis intervention services feeling about telling us about their mood on a daily basis? Is this something that we could use to get some really helpful information? Or would this cause more harm? I'm very sensitive to that as a Black researcher. I'm very sensitive to that as an advocate for mental well-being among Black boys and men. And so we were really, really careful about thinking about safety procedures, making sure that police were not deployed in cases of crisis, scenario interventions, but we had trained mental health therapists deployed. All of that, was fed into the thinking process of getting this work off the ground. The aims were twofold, and they're just a little bit more, condensed and specific. We developed and piloted a 7-day culturally adaptive protocol using smartphones and ecological momentary assessment with Black men. And we wanted to understand also, in addition to like, is this feasible? Is tracking an issue? Is our police an issue with crisis intervention? We also sought to understand if repeated assessments about suicide, how are you feeling, and asking directly. And we know from AFSP advocacy and research that asking about suicide does not, and directly talking about it does not exacerbate that feeling or heighten that feeling. But we've never seen those studies with Black men specifically. And so we wanted to just make sure that we weren't, creating more harm. And so those were also the two sub-aims of the study. We have a paper out in JMIR research protocols that really outlines all the questions that we ask on our smartphone-based app, and really outlines a clear protocol that a lot of researchers and scientists and clinicians and advocates could replicate, because I really believe in open science. So we had this paper that came out that talks about how we came to come up with the 15 questions, what we asked on a daily basis, So you can see here, we have lots of different questions. We ask about suicidal thoughts and behavior. We ask about hopelessness. We ask about major depressive disorder. And then we use those tenets of the interpersonal theory of suicide, the belongingness, the burdensomeness, capability in that short moment-to-moment questionnaire. But in addition, we do a daily end-of-day questionnaire where we're asking about sleep, because we know that sleep and suicide and mental health and well-being is important but underexplored. And then we also, of course, because of the Crux's focus on everyday racial discrimination, we have instances of everyday discrimination that we ask them on a daily basis. Because if you wait much longer, like, okay, what happened this week? You'll get, oh, I forgot, you know. So we ask them on a daily basis what has happened in their day and if they attribute it to race. A lot of people want to know who do we get? So I have our inclusion exclusion criteria here. We targeted Black men ages 18 to 35 using a messaging system through our hospital system at Johns Hopkins, where eligible patients receive information about research. We also went to AFSP walks. We also went to AFSP related community events to recruit, which I think was just an incredible asset for me as a young researcher, to not only use the healthcare system to recruit, but the community, which is so important with reaching Black men and Black boys. We looked for people that had a past history or currently were in treatment for self-injury, for suicidal ideation, or for an attempt, that had a smartphone and were proficient in English. We didn't include folks with active psychosis. We do plan to in the future, but for obvious reasons of getting the work done and making sure people were safe and that we had the appropriate clinical services in place, we didn't include those individuals. And then obviously those that had cognitive deficits or without smartphones were not in our study. So our study was twofold. So I like this visual, which is, you know, the PowerPoint, like basic smart, you know, visual, but we had interviews where we talked to the Black men, and then we had our smartphone project. And I did that intentionally so that I could really, really get a full understanding and snapshot about how racism influenced their daily life, so we could appropriately ask about it, what they thought about smartphones to track suicide-related risk factors, and what those risk factors might be. So we did a lot of individual talking with folks that met criteria for our study, and then we deployed the smartphone-based study. And you can see we also paid them because that was critically important to the work. So yes. So I'll just show you, let me go back a little bit to make sure. This is a brief overview of the two-part study, and I'll talk about the study as a whole and then move into the current results from each phase. So we're kind of nearing, you know, the rounding point here, and I want to leave enough time for questions and answers. But I think what brought a lot of people here was the real-time aspects, the smartphone aspects of the study. So here's what it looked like. We had individuals, so this person here, complete a baseline survey. We asked about gender norms. We asked, you know, age and education and all of the information that you would want to understand about someone before they start a study like this. And then we say, okay, download this app. And thank you to our partners at MetricWire who helped us develop this app. They're a Canadian-based company that does ecological momentary assessment, but a lot of other companies do this type of work. So I've had some questions on this. Is this a commercial app? Not yet, but this is like a research-based company that helps us develop questions and have people download it on the app. Apple and Android phones were both eligible for the study. And then we just had them download the app and say, go about your day. And so during those 7 days, we gave them 4 random prompts a day of just quick, 30-second, how are you doing? How are you feeling? Are you having any suicidal thoughts and behaviors? Because these are people that had a past history or were currently in treatment for. So we wanted to ask them how they were feeling in that moment. And we were also seeing where they were. We were tracking their GPS, we were tracking their accelerometer, how fast, where they were going. And so we're doing both that passive sensing with the GPS and finding their coordinates, and also the active part of the study where we're engaging with them on a moment-to-moment, 4 times a day basis about how they're doing. And this is so important, and I'll get into like the future directions of intervention, because we can understand if there's a moment in the day where an individual has a heightened, sense of, not having really strong mental well-being, not feeling great, we can easily deploy and talk to them and send a caring text to say, how are you doing? Do you want us to check in? Do you want us to bring a mobile crisis unit to your home? Do you want to talk to us? Adding in that social connection in real time to essentially work towards suicide prevention. At the end of this study, because we wanted to understand a lot about what worked and what didn't, we did another exit interview. So we talked to these folks a lot. These are kind of what it looks like on the app. There is some example prompts. So on the phone, it'll be like, okay, it's time to complete your survey. And again, like I've said, AFSP and other advocates of suicide have said the direct questioning of suicide questions are okay. And so that's what we did. We used the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale. Since the last assessment, have you had any thoughts of dying? How intense is this feeling? And then because we were focusing on everyday racial discrimination, we characterized this as racial stress. And so we had an open kind of, they could use it at any time. Please record a stressor if you have one that has been happening in your life in this moment right here. So we could it's basically like a journal entry, an audio journal entry, where they can say, oh, this is what's happening and this is what's going on. So that was how it looked. So going back to the full overview, I will now start to talk about some of the preliminary qualitative findings of our first part, which was the interviews where we asked about suicide risk factors and we asked how racism affected their lives in real time and as a whole. So again, bringing back those unexplored factors for suicide related to Black male suicide research, what you'll see here and what tends to emerge is the unexplored factors related to masculinity and gender. Again, Take It Like a Man and Boys Don't Cry, and how that influences whether and how they talk about suicide, and those experiences of everyday racism and where they experience it. These numbers are not, I think it's 20, over 20 at this point, because we're still recruiting and finishing up this process. But we have some key emerging themes, which I'll talk about now, related to people having experiences of alienation or thwarted belongingness at many different levels. And then socialization, so the experiences of understanding different scripts and norms related to being vulnerable or emotional disclosure and the help-seeking patterns. I'll talk about those two today, and I'm happy to talk about more in the Q&A, but we're still in the process of analyzing. These are all very preliminary, so I'll just launch into it. A lot of text here, so I'll unpack this. Again, we found three themes, and the first theme was that thwarted belongingness, again, social alienation, presented very prominently in the lives of Black men, but at multiple levels, in multiple ways. It didn't just come from one direction. There was personal feelings of alienation from other individuals. People I knew or people I trusted were nearby, and then suddenly they just weren't there anymore, as one participant said. There's collective isolation, so feeling isolated from the Black community. I will say we also included, we were very inclusive in our definition of men. So we had trans men that were in our study. And so this individual said, the first time they tried to join something exclusively for Black men, they were explicitly told, you're not a Black man. And we know that the rates and the intersection of racism and, different attacks against the LGBT community does have a huge heightened crisis for suicide with our youth and our young adults. And this was a clear situation where that was being described. And then again, societal thwarted belongingness. So isolation from society because they identified as a Black man. So I have it bolded just to kind of show where you should rest your eyes. But here, this individual says, especially in instances where you're depressed or, questioning whether life should go on, these kinds of things and these kinds of things are experiencing racism, can start to play in your head where you feel like you're not seen as a valued member of society. All of these things that we're seeing related to racism and civil uprising and, Black Lives Matter, and folks that are protesting those types of, caring responses, that does have an impact on people on a day-to-day basis. And that's what we were finding from our study. We also, and this is again, a really great quote, and I'm gonna say this one in full because it talks about the aspect of police brutality, media, and LGBTQ identity. There's a lot of intersectionality here and what is going on with feelings of alienation and thwarted belongingness in the Black community. So this individual said they had a mini breakdown at their uncle's house because of the whole George Floyd thing. Like, I'm already suicidal, but when I'm not suicidal, I actually want to live my life where there are people out there who don't want me to live on principle because I'm like existing. There's police brutality. There are countries I can't go to. And on top of that, I'm trans. So people don't even like me within my own community because I'm weird. So, it was like kind of a perfect storm of discussions about what was happening in the world related to George Floyd, with protest, with the KKK, with other issues of racism that are kind of, just open season now in the media and in social media, and how that was affecting this individual who was also struggling with their identity and getting support for their identity and their gender identity over time. Moving on to theme 2, again, socialization, which is another jargony term, but it's a process where an individual learns the norms of a group, or learns to adjust to a group and behave in a manner that's societally acceptable. So in this example, like, how do you learn to be a man? How do you learn to be a Black man? And where do you get that information from? But what we learned from our interviews is that these attitudes, these socializations surrounding mental health was a critical precursor to their future help seeking. If they were in crisis or not, it would influence, whether they sought help based on, how they learned about being a Black man. So this individual says, if I get too serious or if I kill the vibe, I'll just be a bleeping downer. So this person felt like they couldn't openly cry or be emotive about their mental health states because of their position as a Black man. Another person said they learned a lot from TVs and movies. And, there's a stigma that Black men shouldn't get sad or feel suicidal. And where'd you learn that? From TVs, movies, and other people, I guess, So it's interesting where people are getting this information from, but it's also transforming and moving into a place where folks feel like they cannot seek help due to prevailing norms or perceptions of what it means to be a man and a Black man. That perception of strength, masculinity, not showing weakness and vulnerability can have an impact on the mental well-being and the crisis, situations that Black men face. So this gives you more insight and information as to why we're seeing some of the trends that we're seeing. I love the aspects of quantitative research because you can track, large scale, trends over time. But I really love hearing these narratives because you can get down to a really complex understanding of what people are facing every day. And we used a lot of that to incorporate into our study. So those were the results of our phase 1. I'll now quickly, in the next 10 minutes or so, talk about the aspects of phase 2, which was our smartphone-based EMA study. Folks received $100 for completing this over a 7-day period, so it was a pretty high incentive by research standards. But we also wanted to really encourage people to be consistent with it, and we were giving them phased money over time. So they received $100 if they completed all of their surveys. And less money if surveys were not completed. This has been shown in the literature as a very good, way to encourage what's called compliance, which I hate that word, but to encourage people to complete surveys. But we were really interested in how intensive is this survey? Is this something people want to do? Is be checked in on by an app 4 times a day or 3 times a day or 2 times a day? Do people complete it? And if so, what are we learning? So here's some initial results about the acceptability and feasibility. We had about 165 total surveys. Again, this number is always evolving because we literally have 3 people out in the field right now with apps on their phones, and my team is tracking them. So this number is always changing. In addition, we have, remember that recording where they can record and say, this is how I'm feeling, this is what's going on in my environment. We had about 19 of those recordings that we're now transcribing and analyzing and trying to understand. We had about a 56% completion rate, a little over half, which is okay, but not great. Most of the literature focused on this process was about 70%, 80% completion. So we're going back into the think tank and kind of trying to tinker with the aspects. And the next slide will kind of give you some reasons why that rate was the way it was. But what's really important in research and AFSP Young Investigation research is that this allows me to get the opportunity to tinker with the work and time to slow down and make it work successfully and efficiently before we scale up in other environments such as Illinois, such as other states that have different crises of suicides. Also, the average completion time was really great. We were hoping to keep it 3 minutes or less because we got to start from somewhere, and we were able to do that. Each survey took on average about 1 minute and 36 seconds to complete, so we really didn't want to disrupt their day. And at the end of the day, their daily diaries took on average about 2 minutes and 31 seconds. So these are like very boring stats, but what it's showing is that this is a proper area of expansion, and there's things that we can tinker with to make this even more successful in other states to understand crisis intervention for Black men. Some general exit interview results, like I said, we had asked them at the end of the 7-day period what they learned and what we can improve, and that was honestly what I'll present for the rest of the talk of today, of like what types of tips they gave us. First, they said it was acceptable, which was like a researcher's dream when they're doing something as intricate as suicide crisis intervention with smartphones over time, with a population like Black men that there's no precedence for. So they said it's exactly the information that they'd be looking for, which was great. The feasibility and the appropriateness of the method in the middle. This one person said, I was worried it'd be too many, which I was too, but it was perfectly fine. It was perfectly okay. And the timing was fine as well. Fine is like high praise for us. And then adoption, like whether people wanted to. This is where I think we got into some issues, and I think this is what affected our rates of completion. This person said it seemed like every time I tried to open the app, it wouldn't open, so I just wouldn't try and do it for a while. So people were missing surveys because of the bugginess of the app. And this is something really important to discuss in mobile mental health research and scaling up this type of work. And I can talk about some of the issues of memory and storage that we had in the phones that created this issue, but it's technology has a lot of promises and it has a lot of pitfalls. And I was very happy that we learned why some people weren't completing surveys, and that was very helpful. Another reason that we learned why people weren't completing surveys that I thought was really interesting and new to the world of suicide research was that depressed mood can have an impact on whether someone is doing this stuff or not. So they're getting a buzz, a little prompt on their phone, hey, complete this survey. And we were hearing from folks afterwards that like, if they're not in a good mood, they're immediately gonna swipe it. Or they tended to ignore them when they were at lower periods because and they knew that that wasn't the goal, but it was very helpful to create an honest environment where they could tell us, hey, when I'm feeling down, I'm not going to do this. And that's something important to understand for suicide prevention. And I tell people all the time when I'm doing talks, check in on your friends, but also when you don't hear from them, also check in with them, because that might be indicative of something that needs to be understood and needs to be addressed. And so it was really great to hear that, folks were telling us this so that we could, really have a response when we weren't hearing things from surveys. We're like, oh, they're just not interested, but they may be in mental health crisis. They're not going to say, oh, I'm feeling really terrible, let me complete a survey, obviously. So this is really great to get on paper for researchers to understand and for people to, understand and improve their work. Finally, I'll just quickly talk about, folks were talking about anxiety leaving the house, which came out from their racial stressors, a lot of physiological and structural concerns. Someone was watching the news and getting really down, saying, things have gotten better, but not even. And so you can start to see how like media influence, how their neighborhood influence, how different structural and environmental exposures of racism really impact their mood. And so we were able to track that over time, in addition to, we'll start to analyze that everyday discrimination scale that we have over time. We asked folks if they could do it again, what could be better? We got so many great suggestions. First, including journal entries throughout the day, because they really like that audio feature and they wanted to just be able to journal. Many apps do it. And so incorporating that feature into an app that also is focused on crisis intervention is really key. Of course, making sure that it's working and prompting during participant waking hours. Some folks were nighttime employees, and so they were sleeping during the day. We didn't have a lot of latitude about when the surveys would be deployed, but we can in the future, and so that was helpful. Changing the clinical feel of questions, which we're always working on as researchers. Interactive features, emojis for momentary mood. I mean, the list went on and on. So it was so incredibly rich to get insight from these individuals as to how we can improve. I'm just going to end with some hope and future directions. I worked on this paper that was recently published with my colleague Roland Thorpe about future directions for Black male suicide research, which Number one is already being hit by AFSP. And again, I'm so grateful of prioritizing funding and strategic frameworks that are centered on Black suicide, sorry, it's not spelled all the way, Black male suicide prevention. This is really key. A lot of Black scholars and investigators focused on understanding the variation in the Black experience have not been funded in the past decade. So we're seeing this rise in suicide rates, but we're not having the right investigators studying this. And I'm so incredibly grateful for AFSP and NIH and other, funding entities that have a vested interest in this, and there's more work to be done. Of course, innovative solutions to maintain continuity of care. In the future, we plan to use this and incorporate this into the healthcare system at Hopkins as a warm handoff between emergency department discharge and getting them their first inpatient or outpatient mental health care appointment, because we're losing a lot of people in between. And I know I have some healthcare providers in here that are probably shaking their heads. Again, understanding the variation of the Black male experience, leveraging advancements in crisis support hotlines. We have 988 now due to advocacy here and safety planning, and then really placing community stakeholders at the fore. That is so incredibly important to me. And I have some colleagues here that I've continued to get more work and research funded through based on this foundational work from AFSP. So that's happening now. We're expanding our community linkages in Baltimore to really understand what places are resources for suicide prevention for Black men. Also, thanks to AFSP, I got funding to expand this for Black youth 12 to 18 and their caregivers, because we know the crisis of suicide starts like in adolescence and earlier. And so that study is starting to get launched and underway, but it would not have been possible without the funding initially from AFSP to understand what we need to work on and tweak for younger populations. We have work understanding the provider perspective. I know there's a lot of providers that have come into this call, and we wanted to ask them essentially, if you were incorporated into a study or a system-wide, improvement that you got day-to-day influence, input on suicide from your patients, would you use it? And some said yes, and some said no, which is very honest, because we know that healthcare professionals and especially mental health professionals are incredibly burnt out. And so we are working on that and making safety the forefront of our work. So it's been really great to start to analyze that work as well. So I say this because this is addressing the crisis of suicide, like I mentioned, but there are a lot of future directions with young folks, with community partners, and with providers that me and my team, the Grace Research Lab, are starting to embark on. With that, it takes a huge village. So here's the village. And first and foremost, of course, thank you to the AFSP, to Johns Hopkins, to NIH, and all of these individuals that have helped the work get off the ground. And then here is my contact information, because I'm almost certain that there'll be lots of questions on this. And I really would love to engage with you guys and have people watch the space, because this research is in its infancy and starting to grow. And I'm really excited to share that through the different means I have here. So with that, I know that was a lot of information for a lunchtime seminar, but I will pause for Q&A.
Hi, Leslie. I'm going to ask that everyone who has a question, can you please put it in the Q&A so that nothing gets lost? I don't want anyone's question to not be answered. Chris asked, you talked about what was next for the study, but when do you envision this particular study being completed?
That's a terrible question for a researcher, because we never feel like things are complete. We're probably going to end recruitment sometime in the fall, feasibly, for our Baltimore study, and then focus specifically on our youth study. So I guess that's the best answer. I mean, there's completion, but we're really using this information to enhance the youth study, which will be ongoing until 2027. So fall for the adults, and then 2027 for the kids.
All right. Mike asked two questions. The first, given the essential nature of hope as a protective factor in suicide prevention, is there a best practice on how to talk about historic and current racism that does not degrade the hope of a good future from Black youth?
Wow, that is such a good question. I think coming back to that Black ethnic identity aspect, I mean, there are aspects of the Black experience that are incredibly powerful and strong, and those are linkages of hope. And so we know from the literature that when you enhance, feelings of pride and support on the cultural heritage of Blackness, it's a good thing. It's not a scary thing. It's not a terrible thing. It's something that people have pride in. And so I think that's an area where we can leverage discussions of racism and say, look how far we've come and look how far we can go. But it also encourages aspects of advocacy to dismantle racism, because it is a weathering effect that generations of Black Americans have had to manage and deal with, all the different ways and ugly forms that racism has formed. So I think acknowledging the truth is necessary, but also acknowledging the power of the Black American experience is a mechanism of hope in the context of racism. And I think that can be leveraged by saying being Black is awesome. I wouldn't change it for the world, So it just, I think there's different ways to leverage that. It's such a good question.
All right. And his second question, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey data and NVDRS data suggest there was a significant increase in African-American suicidal behavior after the George Floyd death. Should we differentiate how we talk about these horrors between adults and youth to avoid deepening already difficult stresses?
Should you avoid how we talk about it?
Should we differentiate how we talk about these horrors between adults and youth to avoid deepening already difficult stresses?
That is so I see it here, Mike, very challenging question, because what we learned from the study and from the smartphone study is it's what you talk about interpersonally, but there's a reality that you just cannot ignore. If I turn on the TV, if I go on social media, I will see what is going on. So to not acknowledge it, I think sometimes can be harmful. I think it's important to talk about what is happening in their everyday life. And there are other researchers, Rihanna Anderson, and other folks that are talking about, what's called the talk, in which Black families are talking to their kids about police brutality and what to do at stops as young as 5 years old. So Black youth know what the realities are, and to not discuss it does not make it go away. So I think it is important, again, to instill hope in both young adults and youth. I think what we're seeing with NVDRS data and other YRBS data is that it's going up from ages 10 to 17, but also 25 to 44. So it's an issue that's informing youth and adult cases in suicide with Black Americans. And this is obviously my professional opinion, but I just don't think you can avoid talking about it, because it is everywhere. And the way that our society is shaped, it is seeped into the ecosystem of media, of conversation, of music. So I think there is a way to talk about it responsibly without re-traumatizing individuals.
Our next question, I want to know, was the disability community included because disability is also an intersectional identity?
Yeah, everybody was included. That was not an aspect of exclusion. So we did include folks that had cognitive deficits on the data, for the understanding of questions over time. But outside of that, the disability community was available to be part of the study. And I'm trying to think of there was no one particularly excluded that did have a disability. I would say the cognitive deficit thing was an exclusion factor, but more often than not, we were excluding people due to the active psychosis. Because we do know that for Black Americans, there is an overdiagnosis of psychosis and an intersection of psychosis and affective, depression and suicide outcomes. So that was more likely the exclusion factor than the cognitive deficits. But there's certainly, I think, a lot of work that can be done to make this more inclusive to the disability community. And I hope my email is still up there, that they can provide some thoughts about that as well.
All right. Will you do a similar project on Black female about the same age group?
So the youth study, because of what we're seeing with the trends, does include Black boys and girls. We are not excluding. And the trends are so on the rise for both. But the reasons are very complex. And again, moving into that social media, the social media damage for mental well-being for girls is really, really stark. So we are not excluding Black girls from our upcoming youth study, and we're hoping to really get a wider snapshot of gender differences that we can intervene on.
All right. Have
It's
you
like
considered,
it's like all questions, yeah.
and I'm just saying it out loud for everyone's
That's
ease.
great. Mhm.
Have you considered raising the age range to 45 or 50 to include middle-aged Black men?
So we just did. So when I said the inclusion interior targeted 18 to 35, we were seeing that people that were hospitalized in our system were in their 40s to 50s to 60s. So we have included older age ranges for the latter half of our study, and that's why we haven't quite ended recruitment yet, because we're getting really rich information from like our 79-year-old individual that's in our study. I mean, he is a smartphone wizard, but like we're having a lot of really rich information about the historical legacy of racism and mental health from those individuals too. So we have expanded, yes.
All right. Working at Inner City Hospital, I also find a lot of Black men admitted, 40 plus admitted for suicidal ideation.
Yeah. So that's what I was saying. And what we're seeing with the NVDRS trends, someone had just mentioned it, which is a CDC data set, is that these trends are moving for 25 to 40. So early adult and middle-aged adults are having this crisis as well.
Are there apps for Black men under 18 and over 35 years of age? Are there apps for other races and females?
Not yet. I think there's a lot of folks that are doing that research, and I want to lift up, Matt Nock at Harvard and Evan Kleiman at Rutgers and Ariel Sheftaw. There's a lot of folks doing this type of work. My work has been focused on Black boys and men because they're typically understudied, and then the suicide research, it has been primarily white individuals, but I have colleagues doing work on American Indian populations. There's a lot of area of expansion. And so it was important to understand how feasible this was so we can start to translate this to other groups.
This is a follow-up. I'm sorry, I just missed your question. I'll see if I can go find it. How did this change the numbers, or was there no significant difference? And the original question was the disability community. So
so I don't think it changed any numbers that we had. I think we could have certainly had more individuals included if we had targeted specific disability advocates or community settings. So I would say probably the numbers could have been higher. But we did have Black men, and I didn't talk about this theme, but a lot of the Black men that were in the disability community in our study did have that feeling of burdensomeness. It was more so that they felt like a burden to others because of their disability, their perception of that they were experiencing suicidal thoughts and behavior. So the results, if we start to dig into it a little bit more, which our team is constantly doing, I think we would see more of a skewed of individuals in the disability community feeling that burdensomeness related to suicide more so than, and alienation. But a lot of folks did not talk about feeling a burden. A lot of folks talked about societal alienation, collective alienation, et cetera.
All right, I'm going to give everyone a last chance to pop a question in the chat. And while I wait to see if any more pop in, I want to thank Dr. Adams for your time. Oh, one more question. Do you have any insights gained from this study that you found surprising or offering hope of a new solution?
Definitely the people not doing surveys due to their depressed mood was surprising. And a lot of the research on EMA doesn't talk about that. It's this compliance, non-compliance talk, but it's not discussing the why. So that was definitely surprising. And the hope is that people were engaged with the app. They wanted to use the app, and the app was just buggy. And so that was really comforting to me. It wasn't that like they hate it and it sucks and blah, blah, but they're like, this could be really helpful. And I believe in co-creation. I am not a Black man. I'm not a Black boy. I want to hear from their lived experience and perspectives on how we can improve that. And they're ready to do it. So we're having another session with them in June to keep co-creating and improving on the app. And that's incredibly hopeful for me, that there's engagement points that we can continue to leverage.
Wonderful. All right, I'm going to keep working on the dismissal, but if another question pops up, we will pause and redirect. Thank you, Dr. Adams, for your time. We appreciate it and your work. Those of you who have not been in the chat, I wanted to let you know that Angela and I are going to try to get out YouTube videos, the
Mhm.
slides, and other follow-up materials, including a survey to help us better plan our next Research Connection program by the end of the week. We are at the mercy of technology cooperating. So if you have to wait till Monday, please forgive us. Please fill out the survey. It'll help me plan the next Research Connection program. As I said, we do these twice a year. And don't forget to check walkinillinois.org. Whether you fundraise or not, showing up reduces stigma, and that helps the cause. If you do fundraise, it helps us fund research. It helps us provide events like this for free. We even do our in-person event for free with a lunch. So please try to get involved in your local walk. Angela, am I forgetting anything?
I think that's it. Yeah, we went a little bit over, but really good job, everybody, keeping the time. That's great. So-
I was trying. I knew it was going to be a lot of questions. As
no,
always.
I know. That means it was a great presentation for Adams. So thank you so much. It was great. So thank you, everybody, for coming. If there are no more questions, we'll let you get back to your day. And thank you so much. And again, please fill out the survey if you can, because it does help inform how we plan these in the future, like Meg said. So, all right.
All right, have a good day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
guys.
Thank you, Dr.
Thanks.
Adams. Thank you,
Of
Meg.
course.